So as you know, Halloween has just passed and a lot of booktubers have been reading books that are horror or just scary, creepy books. They've been doing readathons and they've added a lot of horror books to their TBRs. And I suppose just because it's autumn in a lot of places and winter will be coming soon, it's just that kind of a mood that you want to get into and, cozy up with a blanket and a hot cup of coffee and read a really, really fun and spooky book. So I added a lot of spooky books to my TBR as well, and that's what I read in October. So if you love scary, creepy books, then there are a lot of books in this list that you might like, you might want to read. And there are some not so scary books, but they were okay too. I'll tell you all about them and you can go and check them out for yourself. So the first book I read was The World's Most Haunted House by William J. Hall. Now this is actually based on a true story of a poltergeist haunting in Connecticut in 1974, I think, where this house was being haunted by this poltergeist who was really destroying their home and wreaking havoc. A lot of people were called in to investigate the matter, and a lot of these incidents happened before their very eyes, so they are kind of bearing testament to what happened and they're describing in detail. It's more like a report based on the incidents and the goings on of that time. So in terms of scariness, yes, I mean, it was very intriguing and very interesting to read if you're interested in that kind of stuff, like hauntings and horror related stuff. There is some kind of doubt whether it was a hoax or whether it was real, but after having read the book, I do think it was real and all those things did happen, because a lot of what they described could not have been a hoax. It could not have been set up by anybody because it was just too inexplicable. Certain things you can't just explain away. It was just an interesting book in the way that any description of paranormal books tend to be, but I wouldn't describe it as a horror book. But like I said, if you're into paranormal kind of stuff, then you will definitely find this book interesting. The next book was A Head Full of Ghosts by Paul Tremblay. Now this is about the Barrett family who lives in New England. The elder daughter Marjorie, I think, who's about 14 years old, she starts showing signs of schizophrenia, but they believe that she is actually possessed. The priest believes she's actually possessed and they want to perform an exorcism. A TV crew is called in and they live in the house and they are recording incidents as and when they happen, and there are a couple of weird and strange incidents. But having read the book, I don't really think what happened to her was possession. I think it really was mental illness, and the end is a bit sad and weird. It really got me thinking that sometimes because of lack of knowledge and ignorance, the two things are confused, demonic possession and mental illness. And I think this used to happen a lot more in the past when people didn't know about these kinds of things. This book, even though it creeps you out, it will really make you kind of think of whether it's really possession or mental illness that ails a lot of people who are suspected to be possessed. But it was a really enjoyable book. I really liked it, and it had the right amount of creepy to make me want to keep reading it till the end. The next book was a horror classic by Robert Bloch, and that was Psycho. I'm sure everybody who loves horror and the paranormal knows the story of Norman Bates and his psychotic behavior and his obsession with his mother. I have watched at least 2 film adaptations of this book. One was the original classic by Alfred Hitchcock, and the other one was a film by a very famous director, I forget now, but it starred Vince Vaughn, and I just thought that was a terrible film. I didn't like it at all. And of course, I watched the series on Netflix, which was kind of based loosely on the early years of Norman Bates, but of course the series took a lot of liberties and put in a lot of stuff that is not there in the original book by Robert Bloch. The book was really good, and the film that was made out of this book by Alfred Hitchcock, I think it really added on to the book and kind of sealed it as a horror classic that would be referred to and copied forever and ever. The book is really scary and creepy, and I think the film by Alfred Hitchcock was really it just added to that book and made it into the horror cult classic that it is today. It's always referenced and referred to even today endlessly in other books, in other films, and I think the book is really a classic of horror. I also read Psycho 2, but I didn't like that at all. I intended to read Psycho 3, that is the House of Horror or something like that, but I was disappointed with Psycho 2, so I didn't go on to read book 3. I think the writing of Psycho should have stopped after the original book because it was perfect in its own way, it didn't need any sequel. But yes, definitely if you are interested in horror and psychological thrillers, it's more a psychological thriller, but then psychotic killers are equally horrifying and scary as any ghost or any paranormal being. So I think yes, this is definitely a classic which you must read. The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty. There is a reason why this book and this film has withstood the test of time and put terror into the hearts of people. Now looking back, if you go back and visit this film that was, I think, made sometime in the 1970s, you might think it's a bit cringy because of all the makeup that looks very fake, because we are so used to now all these special effects and all that have turned so indistinguishable from reality that when you look at that you think, oh, this looks like so fake and cringy. But if you consider it as having been made in the time when there was not all this fancy technology and special effects and things like that, it is really amazing for the time that it was made in, and it's really scary. But if you think the film is scary, the book is even scarier. And if you listen to the audiobook as well, that is, I think, narrated by the author himself, it's really quite creepy because he does those demonic voices and things like that. So yeah, scary. I have not seen a film subsequent to The Exorcist, no matter how well it has been made or no matter what special effects have been employed, that will creep you out and frighten you as much as the original Exorcist film did. There's also a TV series that appears on, I think, Netflix. The first season was really great. I enjoyed it a lot. Not so much the second season. It's not based on the book. It's just a loose adaptation of a possession of a girl. And there's a priest involved, obviously, because an exorcism needs to be done. But that's about it. I think the original book needs to be read. And there's a lot of things that you will find in the book that will make sense to you in the film if you've read the book. I would give this book 5 stars, not because the writing is the best, but because of the author's ability to create that sense of horror and disgust in the reader. Yes, definitely. This is a 5-star horror book for me. The next book is also talked about a lot by people who love to read horror books and paranormal books, and that is The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. Now, quite frankly, I do not see what the fuss is all about. So this is basically about a doctor who hires 4 people to come and live in a secluded house because he wants to prove that paranormal activity exists, and they experience a lot of strange and creepy things. One of those 4 people is slowly kind of taken over by this entity that lives in that house. But in terms of pure horror and creeps that a book is supposed to give you, a horror book, I think that's what it's supposed to do. This book doesn't do that. It's just like a very subtle description of person's descent into madness, kind of. I suppose that's creepy in its own way, but for me it didn't live up to all the hype that it keeps getting as one of the classics of horror literature. Another book I read by Shirley Jackson also was We Have Always Lived in the Castle, which is also a very strange book and is also categorized in the genre of horror, but it isn't really. It's about these sisters called Constance and Mary Catherine who live in a castle with their eccentric uncle and whose family has been murdered by administering them poison, and the whole village kind of ostracizes them because they suspect that they have murdered their own family. And that's the only interesting aspect of this whole story. And after that, a few incidents occur, but there's nothing really scary or horrifying about it. It was quite pointless after a while. So Mary Catherine is this strange and eccentric girl, and throughout the book she imagines people who are offending her or, you know, insulting her or being rude to her. She just imagines them dead. I wish he falls down dead. I wish he is stabbed and things like that. And it's really quite odd. I imagine her as a kind of Alice in Wonderland who lives in a strange alternate universe. How Alice would be if she had not fallen down the rabbit hole and met all those strange creatures. She would have probably been an eccentric person like Mary Catherine. But no, I don't think Shirley Jackson is the kind of writer who appeals to me. I've read 2 of her books and I didn't really quite like them at all. A book that I did like was The Visible Filth by Nathan Ballingrud, and this is actually not a book, it's a short story, part of an anthology of stories that he's written called Wounds. And I think the adaptation of this book or of this story is on maybe Netflix, and it's called Wounds there as well. I haven't watched that as yet. I intend to very shortly. Kind of horror that creeps into you slowly is the kind that stays with you for a longer time and makes you look over your shoulder every time. The first time that happened to me was when I read Pet Sematary by Stephen King, and I was really scared of putting the lights out, and I would, turn and look over my shoulder sometimes, because that's really how much that book scared me. I think a book really affects you when you put the light off in the night and you imagine that there's somebody standing in the corner, or that there's somebody under the bed, or when you hear a sound you imagine that somebody's trying to enter your room. I don't think most people really want to be scared like that, but I think that's a mark of a really, scary horror book or a movie, and that's the way horror should be. In The Visible Filth, there's this guy called Will who is a bartender, and there's a scuffle in his bar one day, and one of the teenagers or youngster, he loses his phone and he picks it up and keeps it with him, thinking that he will give it to him later. And then he starts receiving these strange messages and images on the phone that really psych him out, because they're really scary and strange and gory. And he starts wondering like what the hell is going on, because whatever this is, it's horrifying and illegal and probably demonic in some way. And his girlfriend also starts behaving strange. And the thing that I didn't like about this story was that it seemed to be going really fine until the end, and the end just made me think like, what was that? I didn't expect it to end that way. But for the most part, yes, the story did make me feel like all creepy and yuck about it, the way I like horror stories to make me feel. So yeah, that was a good read for me. So The Silent Companions is a book that I saw recommended on BookTube by one of the booktubers, and I don't recall who it was, but I thought I would read about it because it is set in the 1800s and it has that gothic vibe to it. It's about this lady called Elsie Bainbridge who was married and her husband died a few weeks later, so she has to go and live in their home in the country that is quite scary, and she's accompanied by her husband's cousin Sarah, and they have all these servants, but the house is really spooky and weird, and they come across these kind of wooden cutouts which are not exactly statues, but they are very lifelike and they have been painted to resemble real human beings. And Sarah comes across a diary of one of her ancestors, and she describes how these figures or these wooden cutouts, how they were brought into the house and why they were brought into the house, and they kind of have a life of their own, and they start appearing all over the house and cause a lot of grief and mischief. So long story short, Elsie is committed to a mental institution because she is accused of murder, and Sarah comes to visit her. There's a plot twist which I can't tell you. It was, yes, quite enjoyable, and I didn't find it scary, but I found it interesting. But the silent companions, those cardboard or wooden cutouts, they didn't scare me as much as probably the author intended them to scare me, because like it's a wooden cutout. How scary can they be? It's not as if they're growing teeth and biting you and coming to life. So no, but yes, an interesting and enjoyable story nevertheless. Another book in this same haunted house kind of vein was This House is Haunted by John Boyne. So right off the bat, you know that the house is haunted. It's kind of written in the style of Charles Dickens. He tries to create the story in that same way, and he describes this lady called Eliza Kane, who had been living with her father, but since her father passes away and she has no other living relatives, she signs up to be a governess in a far off place in a mansion where there are these 2 children. She knows nothing about the job before she arrives over there, And when she arrives there, she finds that there are no adults in the house, only these two children. And she finds the whole setup very weird and scary. But then she goes about finding out what really happened, and there's a gruesome and horrifying story behind it all. The story is predictable because the title itself tells you that the house is haunted, and you can very easily guess who the ghost is, who the house is being haunted by. There's a part at the end where there's this kind of face-off between two spirits, and it becomes into this paranormal superhero kind of scenario, and you're like, really? No. But despite that, it's quite readable, and you won't really feel like what the hell is going on. You'll be like, okay, fine. Even despite all that, I really enjoyed it much more than The Haunting of Hill House and The Turn of the Key by Ruth Ware. Even those were books based on this haunted house kind of a trope, but this book I enjoyed a lot more than those books. Some people may disagree, but I really did, because of the writing and because of the storytelling. It was much more easy to read, even though it was so predictable, but I enjoyed it anyway. A story that I don't know how to describe it to you is My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix. As you can imagine by the title, I expected this to be a story about an exorcism, and because The Exorcist is so etched in my brain, I expected the story to be really scary, or at least a portion of it that would be a description of a really scary and horrifying kind of battle between the demon and the priest or whoever was doing the exorcism. But this is really a strange story. It's about these two friends, Gretchen and Abby, and they've been together since childhood, and then when they go to high school, Gretchen starts behaving in a really strange manner, which her friend then concludes is because she is possessed by a demon, which it turns out that she is. All her actions throughout the book, it just seemed to me like mental illness. It did not seem like possession to me. Not that I'm an expert in possession or exorcism. When anyone talks about an exorcism, I just think of The Exorcist and that level of horrifying, unmistakable demonic possession, and so the possession in this book did not seem like a possession, and it's more really a story about the friendship between these two girls. She calls in a supposed expert to exorcise her friend, but he runs away, and then she's left to the task of doing it, and she kind of exorcises the demon, not by prayers and established rituals of the Catholic Church. At some point she actually says, I compel you in the name of Phil Collins or something like that, and I was like, just no. Like I said, it's a strange and weird book. It's comedy mixed with horror, and I don't necessarily think that those are two genres that mix very well. So like I said, it's a really weird book, and I don't really think it's a book about horror at all. The horror is quite incidental. The book is actually about the friendship between Abby and Gretchen. So if you read this book from that perspective, maybe you'll get the point of this book. But if you read it expecting there to be some kind of horror shenanigans, then this book is not about that. The last book that I started reading but I didn't finish was Nosferatu by Joe Hill, who is of course Stephen King's son. This book is really big and I started reading it. I went through a couple of 100 pages, but I still need to finish it, which I will do in November. But from whatever I've read of it, I can suggest it to you. It's kind of like Stephen King's books. Not exactly, but I mean, I don't know if I should be unfair and say that since he is his son that he writes like him, because he doesn't really, but he does. So the story is about this person called Charlie Manx, and he is kind of like a vampire, and what he does is he takes away children. He kind of kidnaps them from their parents, who he believes are not very good parents at all, and he takes them to this place called Christmas Land where they can live forever, but they are these cannibalistic little children, and he sucks their life force out of him so that he can turn younger and live forever. But he doesn't see this as a bad thing. He sees this as redeeming these children. And the story is also about this girl called Vic, who has this supernatural ability to find things, and she somehow knows about Charlie Manx and she sets out to destroy him. She has this bike that is kind of like a knife that cuts through the veil that is between the real world and this parallel world where she needs to go to be able to destroy Charlie Manx. And there's a bridge that actually doesn't exist, which is a kind of portal to the other world. I know it's probably not making much sense, but the book is really quite interesting and enjoyable, and it's not a horror book, but it is a bit creepy because of all the children being turned into these nasty little cannibals and all of that. I watched the series on Netflix, and yes, it's quite fun and enjoyable. And there's also another series or film, I think, which is based on a Joe Hill book, The Tall Grass. Yes, I think that's the name, The Tall Grass, which is about this group of people who go into this field of tall grass, and then all kind of strange and weird things start happening to them and they can't find their way out. That's another thing by Joe Hill that I watched. I'll be doing another episode probably on the scary films and TV series that I watched based on horror books that I really love. Horror is a genre that I really enjoy. I love watching horror films and horror TV series. I'll make a video on that as well, so that if you haven't watched any of those series, you can consider watching them and I'll give you my review of them. So that was my wrap up of horror and creepy books that I read in October of this year. I will be back soon with another video all about books and reading, some recommendations and some reviews. So I hope you'll join me then. I'll see you soon. Bye.